John 2:4, and if you want to turn there, you can see why these are so interesting. They said, woman is a Hebrew idiom, and what would be a similar phrase today? And what are some other idioms in other verses spoken by Jesus? Now, you know what an idiom is. If you remember from your 8th grade English teacher, an idiom is something that is not translatable across the board. It's kind of like it's raining cats and dogs. If you did that in the desert region, they'd have trouble understanding that. So it doesn't directly go across. So John 2:4 and idioms and how we handle that. So when Jesus, the bottom line of John 2:4 is Jesus calls Mary woman, not mother, simply to show that she didn't have leverage on him. It's not impolite to call her woman. It was a very, it would be like calling someone ma'am. And so when Jesus calls her woman, you could call it an idiom, but actually it would just be a proper term, showing she didn't have any kind of extra pull with him being his mother. And it's interesting, Jesus never calls her mother. Isn't that interesting? In the New Testament, Jesus doesn't call her mother. He calls her woman. But to John, he says, woman, behold, your son, and behold your mother. But he never refers to her that way, which is very interesting. Now, idioms are good, and I'll just show you one example. I could show you many. But in 1 Peter, here's a common one, 1:13, which says, loins girt. Well, what on earth does loins girt have to do with the spiritual life? Well, men used to wear, like Ben-Hur movies, those long kind of toga robe things. And if you were going to run, before you had to run, you would gather up your flowing toga and you'd wrap it around, pull it up, tuck it in your belt, and kind of make, kind of like swaddling clothes. Well, what the idea of an idiom is, you can't, in the New Testament, go word for word when it's raining cats and dogs. And so each of these has to be explained. Another one that most people don't even understand is heaping coals of fire on their head. That's when Paul's instructing the church in Romans 12. Most of us think of a person that gets that and they would look like me when they got done, It would burn their hair off. But it wasn't that. That was, if you look at Romans 12, let me just show you that, just to give you an example of how hard idioms are. But Paul is saying in Romans 12, at the end there, verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. If so, you will heap coals of fire on his head. And you can get all kinds of crazy ideas out of that, like, yeah, he's going to burn in hell more for that. Or you put coals of fire and it's going to be painful to him. Actually, people back then they didn't have lighters and they didn't have electric ignition. And to have a fire going, it had to start from a fire. And so you always kept a fire going somewhere, or some friend or family member, you could count on them. And when you went over to light your fire, you would bring your scuttle or whatever, your pan, and you'd come over. And if they were stingy, they would give you one briquette. But if they loved you and wanted your fire to start to bake your bread or warm your house, they would get a whole shovelful out of there and they would heap them. And heaping coals in this context, the idiom means don't stingily love, but just if you're going to love your enemy, don't love him so he's not sure that you really loved him. Pile it on and show the love of Christ. So idioms are great, and you can study idioms. There are whole books written on idioms, things that both Hebraic and in the Greek language.